Hi there. Now, in this video, I just want to brief you on the assignment or project for this module. The specification you'll find behind this card here. Now, at a very kind of high level, the idea of the assignment is to take the movies app that you've been developing in the labs, take that as your starting point and extend it or expand it in whatever direction you want to. But I do give you, and I will give you in this video, some suggestions that you might consider. Now, so that's that's one approach you can take towards this assignment. There is an alternative, although very few people do take the alternative. The alternative is that you may be familiar with some other open web API and you'd like to develop a front end for that. Now, you can take that approach if you want to. You might want to check with me beforehand, though, as to what ideas you might have in that regard. The vast majority, if not all, in previous years anyway, students take the Movies app as their starting point and extend it. The deadline for this I've set as the 7th of August. It's a long time away, admittedly. I don't expect you to spend every time between now and then. Well, that depends on when you watch this video, but I don't expect you to spend the entire summer working on this assignment now. You'll have to gauge it yourselves, really. It's probably not a great idea to let it go until the latter part of towards this deadline. If you drop this topic and then try to come back to it a number of weeks later, it can be quite difficult, as it can be, I suppose, in other areas, but it can be difficult to get back up to speed. But you know, it's up to you. You've got your own time management issues that you've got to deal with. The project is worth 60%. What you will be submitting to me is just a GitHub repo, and you'll also be submitting a short YouTube video where you demonstrate the application to me, and we can talk about that. I'll give you some guidelines on that later on, but you know, it should probably be no more than a 10-minute video, I think. And I'm only interested in you demonstrating the video. I won't necessarily require you to explain code or anything like that. Going back to the repo, you do need to complete the README for that, but I will give you a fairly detailed template on how to structure the README. Again, it won't take you more than an hour to write up the README, and you wouldn't really do it until you've finished your work anyway. So, secondly, it's extremely important that you maintain a Git history throughout your work on this assignment. What I'm suggesting to you down here is that essentially every time you sit down to work on the assignment, you should do a minimum of one Git commit for each session, and maybe more than one commit for a session, depending on how long a session is for you. For each commit, just think about the commit message. The commit message should tell me what were you trying to achieve during that session. I guess it's fairly obvious, you know, but just take a moment to think about it and state clearly what you were trying to achieve. Now, there is this principle with commits that you should never commit code that is not working or that has errors in it. You don't have to abide by that rule for this assignment. It's okay to do a commit. So, for example, if you're at the end of a particular session, an hour-long session or whatever that you're working on, and you didn't manage to fix whatever problem you were trying to fix or complete whatever feature you were trying to complete, you should still do the commit, explain what you were trying to achieve, even though it's not a functioning piece of code. That's okay. Right, how are we going to grade it? I've come up with 4 grading bands, which I'm just calling the good 40 to 50 band, the very good band 50 to 70, the 70 to 90 band, and finally the 90 plus grading band. So let's just go through these one by one. I guess it depends on how much time you can afford to put to this assignment as to which grading band you want to aim for. That's completely up to you. Each grading band, I've tried to come up with some sort of theme for them. So in the good grading band, I just want to ensure that you've got a clear understanding of what I'm calling the foundation skills set associated with developing React app. That's what we're trying to guarantee. And I'm assuming now that it's expanding the movies app. I've kind of documented or I've described these different grading bands with that kind of assumption, admittedly, which again, if you decide not to expand the movies app, then I can give you an idea as to what you should be aiming for in your particular case, but you need to talk to me about that. So let's assuming that you're going to expand the movies app, then in the good band, you're certainly developing more pages, but they have the same kind of look and feel and the same functionality as what we've already developed in the labs. So from a UI kind of perspective, you're going to have some new views. Okay, 3+ new views. It's kind of arbitrary, really. I'm saying you're going to probably have some more list views. So the list views or pages that we already have is our homepage. That gives us a list of movies from TMDb. That's the only list view that we have. But in a moment or a little bit later on now, I'll talk a little bit about TMDb. But TMDb also has information on actors. So you can get a list of actors. So you might have a page that just lists actors, cards. You can get the most popular movies of all time. There's a particular TMDb endpoint that returns those. So you might have a page that displays the most popular movies of all time. You can also ask TMDb for a list of movies that are similar to a movie. And the response that you get back, you could use the same home page structure that we've used and that template that we defined, that template component that we defined. You can use all of those components to display the list of similar movies to a movie. So I'm just giving you some examples, but I would classify all of those types of pages as list views. And we already have an example of coding up a list view type component. They would also probably need to be a detail view. An example of a detail view might be an actor's bio, or maybe a detail on a particular TV series, because if you've looked at TMDb documentation, you'll notice that it also has endpoints related to TV series. From a routing point of view, you're going to have a couple of new routes, and at least one of them should be a parameterized route. So for example, if you decided that you're going to show an actor's bio page, then the URL associated with that page would be a parameterized URL where the parameter would be the actor's ID, I guess. But you need to have at least one parameterized URL. The similar movies would be another example. If you've got a page that lists movies that are similar to a movie, then that page's URL would have to have the movie's ID as part of its URL. So either way, you'd need to have at least one parameterized URL in your list of new routes. By data hyperlinking, the only example of data hyperlinking that we have so far is where we click on a card's more info. Data hyperlinks is the term that I'm using to indicate hyperlinks embedded within a page as opposed to hyperlinks in the page header or page footer. So if you get an opportunity to have some data hyperlinking, you should use that. So for example, you might in your actors, supposing you had the actor's bio page, and in that page you listed all of the movies that actor appeared in, then clearly those list of movies could be hyperlinked to bring you to the corresponding movies detail page, for example. From a data modeling point of view, I'm saying that you should be dealing with at least one new data entity. The only well, there are two data entities that we've been using so far in the Movies app that we're rolling out in the lab. There is the movie data entity and the review data entity. Well, you need to add at least one more. The obvious examples again would be actor would be a new type of entity. TV series would be a new type of entity. You should be using caching everywhere. In terms of new functionality, because everything so far is, okay, these are new pages, but they're not terribly exciting. Routing is technical, data model is kind of from a technical point of view. In terms of functionality, maybe I'm suggesting you could have some additional filtering and sorting options in that filtering card that we have, where we click on the filter action button and it displays our filtering card on the left. At the moment, we can only filter on the basis of genre and movie title, but maybe you could add some more criteria that would allow the user to filter whatever list of movies they're currently looking at. And it's up to you to decide what other filtering criteria. The other filtering criteria would be determined by what other properties are associated with a movie that you might want to filter on. Sorting is self-explanatory. The My Fantasy Movie feature, I've broken this up into two parts now. I'm saying that there's a basic My Fantasy Movie feature, which would really translate into having a web form that allows you to enter some properties for your Maria fantasy movie. And I'm stating down here that we're only interested in, let's say, in certain properties that you're allowing the user to enter. So you're allowing the user to specify, where am I detailing? The title of the movie, an overview of it, a list of genres. So that's probably going to be a drop-down menu where the user can select multiple entries in the drop-down menu. A release date for the movie Maria. It would be nice if you had a date picker component. And if you do a quick Google search on React date picker, then you'll get lots of third-party components that would implement that for you, rather than entering the date as some sort of string, which can be error-prone. Runtime, numeric, production company, that probably should be a drop-down menu as well, because there is a TeamDB endpoint that gives you the list of production companies that it has on record. So presumably you should select one of those. So it's a simple web form really is all I'm asking you to develop here. And the context for the web form is, let's say, you're recording your fantasy movie. Now, where are you storing that? Well, you're going to have to store it for now. You will be storing it in a context, I guess, context construct. So all of that, if you could achieve all of that, then you're guaranteed to get it within the 40 to 50 grade band. Moving up to the next one. What I'm trying to ascertain as to whether you can actually adapt the use of the React framework to do other things that we haven't done so far in the lab. In other words, to develop features within the React app that are new in terms of their structure, their component structure, in terms of their UI component structure, and UI style, etc. You don't have to go overboard on the styling side of it, because I have done very little on styling, to be honest, but it's more functionality that I'm trying to get at here rather than UI styling. So, and also, you're comfortable experimenting with the framework and experimenting with JavaScript as well, I guess. Trying to break that down into a little bit more detail for you in terms of the UI. You would have what I'm calling extensive data hyperlinking. Because now presumably, you're going to have, let's say, 5, 6, 7 new types of pages. And at the end of the day, they're all related to movies, actors, movies. So there should be, anywhere you see a movie title appearing on a page, should be hyperlinked to bring you to that movie's detail page. Anywhere you see an actor's name, it should be hyperlinked, and so on and so forth. So look for every opportunity to use data hyperlinking. Pagination. Now it turns out, if we just go back to, let's say, we can actually look at it here. If I go into my API code and I'm just interested in the structure of the URL that we send to TMDB. So let me just try and break it down now. You've got what's called the query string part. So you've got the domain name, you've got the endpoint within that domain, and then you've got what's called the query string, which is everything that appears after the question mark, which you're familiar with from your studies on HTTP. And the query string is made up of key value pairs. So one of the keys in my query string is that, and the value is whatever I'm assigning to it. The next key is this one. The next key is that one. So the AND is concatenating all the keys. And it's the very last key that I'm interested in, which is this one here. So it turns out that and this is related specifically to the discover endpoint now. The discover endpoint is paginated. Now, we have up to now always been asking for the first page of movies from the discover endpoint. But in fact, this page attribute can have any value from, I think it's 1 to 200. So there are lots and lots of other movies that we don't see at all in our homepage at the moment, in our movies app that we're developing in the labs, because we've hard-coded it to page 1. But it would be nice if our homepage had that kind of standard pagination hyperlinking at the bottom of the page, so that we could click on other pages and subsequently make other requests to TMDB for the other pages of movies that it has in its data store. So that's an example of something that you might try and tackle for this grade band. And indeed, any of the other, what I might call listing views. So well, we only have one really at the moment, which is the home page. But if you were getting a, did you do the upcoming movies? I think you did the upcoming movies actually page in last week's lab. That's also a paginated endpoint. If you wanted to get a list of actors, that's also paginated. So pagination is supported in lots of other parts of the TMDB API. But you would start with the homepage and try and implement pagination there. Now, I've got some other stuff to talk to you about in relation to pagination a little bit later on, but we'll just move on for now. From a routing point of view, I'm saying have basic authentication. By that, I mean take the authentication and protected routes solution that I provided, that I discussed with you last week. Essentially take that solution and lift it and drop it into your movies app so that you have what I'm calling basic authentication supported. And therefore that would allow you to have private and protected, public and private routes. So for example, maybe the movie's detail page could be a protected route. You have to authenticate before you can see a movie's detail page. Also, we could use authentication to control access to particular pieces of functionality. Let's supposing the user cannot do filtering of the movies unless they've authenticated. So filtering is notably some sort of premium feature that I have in my application, Maria. Another obvious example would be the user cannot select favorites unless they have authenticated first. So that's at the functionality level rather than at the page level. We already know how to do it at this level. Doesn't take a whole lot extra to achieve protection of particular features. Functionality-wise, well, if you are pursuing the actor side of things and you're displaying, let's say you're displaying a list of actors, or you're displaying all of the actors in a particular movie, then I guess a simple thing might be to implement a favorite actors feature, which would be very similar to the favorite movies, obviously. So you could reuse a lot of that idea, but in relation to actors. Or if you're more interested in TV series, similarly, you could have a selecting of your favorite TV series from a list of series. Multi-criteria search. Now, that brings me, I'll come back to that in a while because I need to look at the detail of TMDB, but the idea here is to have a web form with lots of user controls on that form, which the user would select and enter, and then click submit. And the effect of the submit is you're sending a request to TMDB for movies with particular characteristics. The characteristics might relate to, did a particular actor, I'm only interested in movies that a particular actor appeared in. I'm only interested in movies that were produced by a particular production company. I'm only interested in movies for a particular genre or set of genres, or a combination of all of those. So that's what we mean by multi-criteria search. Now, you could spend a lot of time, you could have lots and lots of criteria, but you could limit it to maybe 4 or maximum of 5 criteria. And it's up to you to decide what criteria to pick. But I do need to come back to this idea in a second to show you how you would actually do that with TMDB, because it is built into TMDB already. The option to request, be it movies or actors, but let's stick with movies, the ability to request movies with certain criteria is already available to us. In other words, if I actually just look here, for example, it's really with these keys, you can specify the various criteria. That's essentially what we're doing here. What I'm saying is I only want movies from the Discover endpoint that are where US English is the main language of the movie. And to keep it clean here, I'm saying I'm only interested in movies that are not categorized as adult movies. But if we look up the documentation on TMDB, so these are 2 criteria, but if we look up the documentation on TMDB, we'll see that it has, I think I checked it there yesterday, it has 32 different criteria that you can specify in the query string, all of which allows you to narrow down the particular movies that you want to have included in the response that's sent back by TMDB. So you'd have a web form which allows the user to enter the criteria. Then when the user submits that web form, what you would need to do programmatically is essentially construct this query string and then tag on that constructed query string on to the end of this URL. So there's a bit of, from a JavaScript point of view, there's a little bit of work there in doing the construction of the string. I'll come back to it though, but that's what I mean by multi-criteria search. I'm always open to other suggestions from you. But if you manage to get both of these working, then I'd be happy with that. Now, invariably, if you're in this grade band, you're probably going to be developing some new components apart from page components. Now, you're going to be developing some new components. And so you should have some storybook support for those components. You know, in the previous grade band, you may well get away without having to write any new low-level components yourself. So you don't need any additional storybook support in that case. Moving on to the 70 to 90 grade band. If we just fast forward to here from a functionality point of view, again, these are just suggestions that I'm coming up with. It would be nice, we know how to select our favorite movies and they get added to our favorite movies page and they're stored in our context, but we've no way of ordering those favorites. So, you know, we might have our number one favorite movie or number two, etc., etc. So if there was some way to allow the user, once they had selected a movie as being their favorite and it gets added to the list, to maybe subsequently, either immediately or at some later stage, allow them to shuffle the list of favorite movies into the order that they would like. If I just bring up the app itself for a second and close off all of this. So I'm going to select some favorites. Now, one thing you might do is, you know, you could have a left arrow, right arrow on each of these cards. And if I click my left arrow, that moves this card to here. In other words, it shuffles it up. And so I could play around with those arrows to order these in the way that I want them to be ordered. My favorite, second favorite, etc., etc. You've got to store them that way in the in your context as well. Remember, we're storing them in an array, so you'd have to shuffle the array in the context as well, but that's straightforward enough. So that's one way of doing it, of implementing the ordering of your favorites. Or you might have some sort of an icon here. When I click on that icon, it opens up a little text box and I can enter the position of that I want this movie to move to. So I enter 1 here and hit return. And now this card shuffles over here. And this becomes number 2, this is number 3, and this is number 4. That would be another way of allowing the user to order their favorites. Or you could come up with some other way that looks nice from a UI perspective. But any one of those two approaches from a UI perspective would be nice. That's what I mean by ordering of favorites. Similarly, if you had actors, favorite actors, same kind of idea, but just do it for one context would be sufficient. There's no need to repeat it. Ordered favorites, creating themed playlists. If I'd like to be able to create my own movie playlists, and for each playlist, it would have a title. You can just come up with whatever you want to, just be a piece of text. The theme for that playlist, again, that's just text. And then the list of movies that you have added to that playlist. and presumably it would be nice if you could remove movies from a playlist, etc., etc. So the ability to create a playlist initially, I guess, add some entries to it, and then maybe add other entries later on, remove entries from the playlist, but you have multiple playlists options. At the moment, I suppose you could say that the favorites is a type of a playlist, but not really. We like to give the user more control in terms of what title they want to associate with the playlist, the theme that they want to associate it with it. And it's up, the theme is just a piece of text, right? Fantasy movies or science fiction movies, whatever, science fiction movies before 1980, whatever. You can come up with any theme that you want to. It doesn't really matter. It's the ability to create them, add movies to them, remove movies from the playlist. So that would take a bit of work really to try and get something working. It doesn't have to be, from a user experience point of view, doesn't have to be squeaky clean. It's more just the functionality of getting it working would be more important from my perspective. Going back to the fantasy movie, I'm saying now if I'd like a more advanced version of this fantasy movie idea. And by advanced, I mean the ability, and I explain it down here, the ability to add actors and roles to your movie. So initially, we are in our basic form of this fantasy movie, we have a simple web form with just some text fields and drop-down menus. Where had I it? Back here. We just had a simple web form with some text fields, drop-down menus, check boxes, whatever was appropriate. But now, in addition to that, have the ability to add a role to the movie, the name of the role or the character's name, and then be able to select an existing actor from the list of actors that TMDB provides and associate that actor with that role. How might that look? Let's see. So let's supposing I have, if I go to the movie's detail page. So let's supposing this now is showing my fantasy movie. We won't have images. We don't have to have all of this stuff. We do have a title. We have an overview. Well, we might have genres, all right. But maybe there's some button here that says add a role. And when I click on that, it can either open up some sort of a web form here or go to a new page. And on that web form, I'd enter the name of this particular character. And maybe there's an add actor button here. When I click on that, I go to a page that just lists actor cards. So it lists actors a bit like this. So instead of movie cards, I have actor cards. And I can somehow click on a card and that associates that actor with that role in my fantasy movie. And I can do that a number of times. That might be one way it would work. From a user experience point of view, it would be okay. Or you might come up with a slightly smoother implementation of it. Again, I'm not too fussed about the user experience as long as it's reasonable. What we don't want is in my fantasy movie page, let's supposing this is my fantasy movie page. What I don't want is a simple drop-down menu of all of the actors in TMDB and select one of them. That wouldn't be great. Something slightly better than that. So that's the advanced fantasy movie or some variation on it. From a routing point of view, I am looking for you to bring in a more robust authentication implementation using a third-party authentication library. And in particular, I'm mentioning Supabase. Supabase is very similar to Firebase. A lot of you may have come across Firebase already. I don't want people using Firebase though. I'm specifically requesting you to use Supabase. It's very similar to Firebase in terms of how you use it to implement your React Apps authentication functionality. So if you click on that link, it'll bring you to the Supabase homepage. And so you'd obviously have to read up a little bit on how you can use Supabase authentication with React. Lots and lots of articles out there on that. Supabase also provides a backend persistence feature, just like Firebase does. I think it's called Firestore. Again, if you're familiar with Firebase, you probably would have heard of Firestore. Supabase has a similar feature. I'm not sure what it calls it exactly, but it has a persistence feature as well as authentication. Because the theme for this grade band is independent learning, and that's where the independent learning mainly comes in. You'd have to just read up on the use of Supabase. And finally, and this is not as daunting as it might sound, deploying your React app to a cloud provider service. I'm suggesting Vercel is one. This is actually quite easy to do. So this is the least demanding part of this grade band to get deployment working. You can go to the Vercel site and find out how to deploy your React app to Vercel, or if you've used Netlify, that would do as well. Any deployment platform, I don't really care which one you use. And then the outstanding, it really, in this grade band, I'm saying you could bring in backend persistence. In other words, use the Supabase persistence feature to, for example, store your fantasy movie, store your list of favorites, that idea. And also maybe the whole user experience of the various features that you have developed are quite impressive, maybe from a material UI perspective, but getting that would be sufficient. Now, some of you might decide, look, I'm only going to aim for, let's say, I'm only going to aim for this grade band here. Well, you can still, if you want to, for example, do the deployment, and you will get marks for that. So you'll get marks essentially for everything that you document in the README and show in your YouTube video recording of the demonstration. But I've also, in this assignment specification, I have a link to a second page which talks a little bit about TMDB. I think the starting point for this assignment is to spend about an hour or so poking around the TMDB docs to see what are the various endpoints that are available to me that I can use. So far in the labs, we've used the discovery endpoint, we've used the movie details endpoint, we've used the movie reviews endpoint, and we've used the genres endpoint, 4 of them that I can recall off the top of my head. There are lots and lots more of them. And if we click on this link here, brings us to the docs. And if we scroll down to this part of the docs down here, this is where you get all the information on the various endpoints that are available to you. And so if we pick the discovery one, which is the one that we've been using, click on it, shows you how to use that endpoint, which we're already familiar with. You can make a GET request to this endpoint, and it shows you the structure of the response, shows you how you need to authenticate, which is essentially using your API key. It shows you what options are available to you in terms of the query string. That becomes very important in relation to our multi-criteria search, which I will come back to in a second. But and it also shows you, tells you about the response structure as well. So there are various other, and so you need to just, as I said, poke around the different endpoints just to see what's available to you before you decide what you're going to develop. Going back to discovery endpoints, and this is a point I was making a while ago. I'm saying that there are lots of query string options available to you when you're using the discovery endpoint, for example. And I showed you in the code there a while back that the query string is that part of the URL that appears after the question mark in the query string. And the query string from a structural point of view is a set of key value pairs. And again, I'm showing you that here. Now, if we do look at the discovery endpoint, go back to TMDB, which I've just looked at there a moment ago. And if I scroll down, to the query string part, and here it's telling me all of the different keys that I can use in my query string. So I can specify the language that I'm interested in, which is one of the keys that I've been using so far. I'm not going to go through all of them, obviously. Just pick up maybe some interesting ones. You can actually get it to sort the array of movies that it returns back to you. That may or may not be useful. You can specify the certifying country. Not too interesting. Let's see. And you see here, there are 32 different query string options available to us. And that's really what will facilitate this multi-criteria search that I'm talking about. And you can look down through them yourselves. I just try and pick out one or two vaguely interesting ones. We're only interested in movies that have has a certification of less than or equal to a particular certification category. There is another endpoint that tells you what are the different certification categories that TMDB supports. Let's see, include that we had already. Include video is not so much multi-criteria search now, but you can get TMDB to return trailer videos. So you could have that as actually a feature. I didn't mention it anywhere in my specification, but the ability to watch a movie's trailer videos embedded within one of your, I guess the movie detail page would be an appropriate place to put that. The page property we've talked about at length. Let's see if there's any other interesting ones. Movies that were released after a particular release date, you can specify. Dates are always tricky things to work with. I'm not sure if I'd go for that one though, but let's see. Year would be straightforward enough. We're only interested in movies that that is associated with a particular year, I guess. I'm not sure if that's release date, but it wouldn't really matter. We also know that TMDB has popularity kind of stats associated with each movies. So these two here, vote count and vote average, you know, maybe you're only interested in movies that were voted by a certain number of people and that have an overall voting average of a certain value or greater than or equal to a certain value. With cast is quite an interesting one. You're only here, you would specify, if you look across, you assign actor IDs in a string, a comma separated string, and you specify that string as your with cast query key, and so it will only return movies that particular or any one of the actors actually appeared in. So you're only interested in those movies. So that's a fairly detailed search that TMDB does on the server side. So you'd have to construct the string with your actor IDs, which you've gotten previously somehow from TMDB, construct your string and then assign that string to this property here, send out your request, and you get back only those movies that had those actors in them, and so on. And you can look through some of the rest of the 32 options. As I said, pick maybe 5 would be more than enough in your multi-criteria search. That's the discover endpoint. So it's a lot more powerful than what we have been using it for up to now, as well as being a paginated endpoint. The movies endpoint, we've used that already. It has both what I'm calling parameterized and static options. So the movies endpoint, let's just quickly find it on TMDB's documentation. So there's lots of options here, actually. So get movie details, that's the one we've been using so far. See, get credits is where you're going to get a list of all of the actors in that movie. In fact, what you get is what it calls the cast and crew. So you get all of the actors in the movie and all of the production team. No, we're not, which it calls the crew. We're not interested in the production side of it. We're only interested in the actors. So if you, how do we use that endpoint? If we click on it, so it's get/movies, a particular movie ID/credits, and you get back a data structure. Now make sure you examine the structure that's sent back to you, because you will need to drill down into it to get the list of, to get the actors information. And I think it just gives you the actor's ID, maybe some brief details on them, but then you can use that actor's ID to get a bigger profile of the actor if you have an actor's detail page, for example. As well, in the movies endpoint, there are things like, I see here, get similar movies, get reviews, which we've looked at already, or we've used already. Get similar movies does what you think it does, and some others as well that are kind of useful. So some of these endpoints are parameterized. Then if we scroll right down to the end, there are also these kind of non-parameterized or static ones. So this one here returns the most popular movies of all time. You can see the URL is not parameterized in this case. Again, this is actually a paginated response as well. So it gives you, initially gives you the top 20 most popular movies, but if you want movies from 21 up to 40, you move on to page 2, etc., etc. That's the movies endpoint. Lots of options there available to us. The people's endpoint is where we get details on actors and production people. Again, there are parameterized and static variations within that. So if you want to get a person's full bio, or you can get a list of the movies that an actor has appeared in, or a list of the TV series that an actor has appeared on. Quickly find those on TMDB. Here's people. So here, get movie credits is where you get a list of all of the movies that a particular actor has appeared in, provided you know their ID. and on it goes. Trending endpoints, trending movies, trending actors, certification endpoints. That's that can be useful, but there's probably only one part to it where it just returns the different certification categories that TMDB uses. Companies would be production companies, TV series, lots of stuff available there, TV series, episodes, and on it goes. So as I said, spend about an hour minimum, I would say, poking around, just seeing what's available to you. Now, if I go back to one thing that I missed actually earlier on, and it relates to pagination. So if I go back to the specification and where I mentioned pagination, here, and I have a note on pagination down here. Now, okay, we know that TMDB supports pagination, but the React Query library supports pagination as well. There's a couple of aspects to this now. If I go to here, let's say, have I lost my... Yeah, let's just, sorry now. I bring in my caching app again. I hope now the caching is still there. I didn't remove it. Did I remove it? Okay, let's hope. All right, I'm just going to close off some stuff here first. Now, if I can't fix this quickly, then cannot read property of undefined. Good old standard error. I wonder what did I do? Let's just do it this way. Oh yeah. Let's just undo all of that. Right. Now, the key that I chose for the list of movies was this one, right? But I've now told you that the discovery endpoint is paginated. And so if I had pagination available to me here, so I might have your, your classic kind of pagination links down here, 1, 2, 3, 4, and I could click on them and it would bring me a different set of movies. But if I'm going to be caching all of that, then this key here now is no longer sufficient. I'd need to include the page number in the key as well, because if I'm looking at page 1 and I click on page 2 brings me those 2 movies. If I then go back to page 1, I don't want my app re-requesting the list of movies associated with page 1, i.e. I want my cache to store them for me. But this key now is no longer sufficient to support pagination. So I need to include the page number as well in this key. Turns out, though, that the React Query library is aware of that aspect of caching, the idea that, you know, apps may have a pagination aspect to the server state data that they're storing. And so if I go back to my assignment specification, I've mentioned it here that the React Query does actually guide you as to how you should include pagination in your caching support. And if you click on the hyperlink, it brings you straight to the React Query documentation and to a particular page within the documentation. And so you would need to have maybe a bit of a read of that particular page, maybe do some further Googling as well. But the answer is in here really as to how you could include pagination in your caching keys. You might notice there on the top left, it's not calling it React Query, it's calling it TanStack Query. TanStack is, I think it rebranded React Query there a couple of years ago. Originally, React Query, as its name suggests, was written specifically for the React framework, but the creator of the library developed a more generic form of it so that it could be used with other single-page app frameworks. If we actually click on this link, you can see that it supports other frameworks as well, like Vue and Svelte and Solid, etc., etc. And there are other aspects to the TanStack library, which we're not interested in for this assignment. But just to go back to what we are interested in, also, I should say, you'll notice that we're looking at version 3 of the React Query stroke TanStack Query library. There is a newer version, version 4, which I think you should probably just avoid using at this stage, because if you start introducing version 4, then that might break some of the existing code that we have. I haven't really checked it, to be honest, but version 3 is sufficient for us. There is an awful lot more to managing a browser-based cache, which React Query takes care of for us, and we're also kind of ignoring that in what I've covered with you, and I don't think you need to concern yourselves necessarily, depending on how much work you do in the assignment. You know, if you think about it, we're only ever reading data from our backend and then storing it in the cache in the browser. We never actually update that data and send the updated data back to our backend. If you want to do that, or if you need to do that if one needs to do that in their application, then that complicates issues for the developer. You have to make decisions about how you're going to keep your the data in your cache in sync with the backend as the backend is being modified. So you have to incorporate what are called mutators in your React Query coding, and I've stayed away from all of that. So there's a lot more to cache management which we haven't looked at. You may like to just browse around the rest of the documentation for this React Query library in your own time. It's up to you. Now, apart from what I've been discussing here, there is a second aspect to introducing pagination into our app, and it is the UI part of it, if you like. By that I mean, if I just bring up a standard, if you think of these hyperlinks down here, this is their standard kind of pagination links that you will need to implement as well. Now, you don't have to. There are lots of third-party libraries that you can get to do that for you, so you don't need to develop these yourself. Again, just do a Google search on React pagination user interface, and you'll get a third-party libraries that will take care of that for you. And then you just need to hook the third-party library UI part with your React query backend, with your React query code. That's all part of the challenge, I guess. So that's about it really in terms of the my coverage of the specification. If you have any questions on it, feel free to contact me on Slack and I'll try and deal with them. And certainly if you intend doing something other than expanding the Movies app, you would need to contact me as well about that. Okay, thanks.